Our next presenter, Scott Hill. He is here to share with us the story of the deadly shooting at Virginia Tech, a day our country and that college community will never forget. Scott was named Chief Executive Officer of Montgomery Regional Hospital, now Lewis Gale Hospital, Montgomery, in June of 2006. Prior to this, he served as CEO for the Northern Virginia Community Hospital and Dominion Hospital. He began his career in the cardiac rehab program at St. Francis Hospital in Columbus, Georgia. Scott was at Montgomery that day, that morning of the shooting, and he spent the rest of his day in the command center. Scott, will you join us?
Thank you all for having me here today. I'm very excited to be here, and just want to extend a thank you to Jane as a CNO, because I can tell you as a CEO to have a great CNO doing what she did that day, which was the same role that my CNO fulfilled the day of the shootings, is just, you can't put a value to it. So Jane, thank you for your amazing work. I feel like I just really need to say that right now. So this is the front of the hospital. As the MC indicated, I've been at the hospital for about 5 years. Blacksburg, Virginia is a town of about 41,000. It sounds like from some of the comments and questions that were made earlier, maybe a population or service area size of 150,000, maybe similar to what some of the hospitals here in this room experience. It is a small area, and we are a small community hospital. It's nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. If any of you are ever wondering why the Blue Ridge Mountains are named that, this picture gives you a good feel for that. It is really an idyllic setting. We have just an amazing, beautiful geography around us, and it's really a wonderful place to live and raise a family. I'm actually grew up about an hour and a half from Blacksburg, Virginia, and have been very pleased to be able to spend the majority of my career in the state of Virginia and live in Blacksburg for the last 5 years. Just a little bit about Virginia Tech. It's it's the state land-grant university. It's about a 2,600-acre campus. It's located smack in the center of Blacksburg. There's about 26,000 students and about 1,300 faculty on the campus. It's really a beautiful campus. As probably many of the campuses around here are, you can imagine every building at Virginia Tech is made of a limestone that's actually called Hokie stone, and it's really the type of campus that you would see in a movie. When the leaves turn colors in the fall, it's just an amazing place to be, and it's hard to imagine that you could go from that to this, and the intensity that this situation had. As you can imagine, with this being a national story, there were just some very amazing lessons to learn from this, and I'm going to get into that with you all. I think it's important for me to let you know that you're really the first external group that I've spoken to about this. I've done some internal presentations within our corporation and our company, and I teach a class to the Master's in Healthcare Administration graduate students at Virginia Commonwealth University each year, which is where I'm an alumni. So it's been 4 years, but it's still a little emotional, and I hope that if I just have to take a pause or whatever, you'll bear with me. As I think back to that day, it was really kind of a Monday morning like really any other, to be quite honest with you. I'd been traveling the weekend before, was looking forward to getting into work and getting caught up, but got a call real early in the morning about a shooting on Tech's campus. There had been two students that had been shot. And so I got ready quickly and hustled into the hospital. And as I walked out the door, I realized it was unseasonably cold. April is really a transitional weather month for us in Blacksburg. It was 32 degrees, and the wind was blowing steadily at 30 to 40 miles an hour with gusts up to 60 miles an hour. And it was there were snow flurries, which was just really weird for that time of the year. This is a picture of the hospital. Unlike Rhode Island Hospital, I think our hospital would probably fit in their emergency room. It is the emergency room is over on the far right-hand side. That's the ambulance bay, and then we have 4 floors, and we are a licensed 146-bed facility, certainly not big, licensed by the state of Virginia and accredited by Joint Commission, as I'm sure many of you all are also. We have a level 3 trauma center, though, in our emergency room. Years ago, prior to me becoming the CEO there, the hospital made a decision that it was important for us to commit to a basic level of services in our emergency room. And so we chose to pursue trauma designation as a level 3, which is the lowest level you can get in the state of Virginia, given our proximity to Virginia Tech and Interstate 81, which is a major north-south corridor in the state. We do everything at our hospital except open up your brain, open up your skull and touch your brain, open up your heart and open up your chest, touch your heart. We do it all. We have a very high level of service for a community-based hospital. We have a primary PCI program. We're getting ready to start an elective PCI program. We're a core teaching hospital for the Virginia College of Osteopathic Medicine. You can see down in the right-hand corner, we're also a magnet hospital. We obtained our magnet designation in February of 2009. There are other hospitals in the area. Our closest hospital is about 15 miles away from us, owned by Carilion, which is a large not-for-profit medical center. We are owned by HCA, which is based out of Nashville, Tennessee. HCA is the largest non-governmental provider of healthcare services in the United States. We have about 170 hospitals nationwide. So in Southwest Virginia, there's two systems. There's HCA and there's Carilion. The closest hospital to us is about 15 miles away, which is a Carilion hospital. This is Norris Hall, where the main shooting took place. This is actually after the event when the building was closed down. You can see the green fence. I just want to talk a little bit about the topics of discussion for today. We're going to briefly go through the EMS response. I have a lot of slides in the slide deck in the presentation outline you can see. So I'm going to move quick on some of this stuff, and I'm going to back off on where I feel like we need to make some good points. And so we're going to talk about EMS, the hospital response with timelines, what went well, the lessons learned, and then talk about the recovery and the human spirit afterwards. So the EMS environment in Blacksburg, there's 6 volunteer EMS stations. All of the EMS in our area is volunteer. There are very few paid EMS positions in our area. There's 2 squads in the immediate vicinity. Virginia Tech Rescue Squad, you'll see the abbreviation VTRS, that's throughout the packet, and Blacksburg Rescue Squad, BRS. Early in the morning at about 7:21, there was a call that came out over the radio for a need for a response at West Ambler Johnston Hall. They thought a student had fallen from a loft. The Tech Rescue Squad responded, quickly found out that there was quite a different story. After they made patient contact, they realized 2 subjects with gunshot wounds. At 7:35, they called for lifeguard, Carilion helicopter, the Carilion-based helicopter that's based out of the Level 1 Trauma Center, which is about 42 miles away. They were advised that the helicopter could not fly that day due to weather conditions, and that they would not be able to fly until the weather changed significantly. So at 7:44, both those patients were transported to Montgomery Regional Hospital. And at the time, it was thought that there was a lover's triangle or a lover's quarrel that had occurred, and that somebody had lost their temper, and this was the ultimate outcome of that. In the press and in the media, Virginia Tech took a lot of heat about how come you didn't cancel classes, how come you didn't, because really at the time there was really no sense of what was to come. There was a manhunt. They were looking for the young man of the woman who had been shot. Ironically, they found him in class at Radford University, which is about 15 miles away. I mean, could you imagine a college student actually being in class at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning? But that's where they found him, and after they found him, they quickly realized that that wasn't the case. Unfortunately, by the time they found him, it was about 9:45 or so, and that's when the shootings in Norris Hall began to take place. At 9:46, Virginia Tech Rescue Squad was the initial response. They did set up a command center close to Norris Hall. They contacted Blacksburg Rescue Squad quickly because the call came out over the air that there were multiple gunshot wounds. And about a minute after they called for Blacksburg Rescue Squad, they called all Montgomery County EMS agencies. We realized this was going to be a huge event. There was a lot of initial chaos, as you can imagine, but quickly Blacksburg and Virginia Tech came together and formed a command post that was able to really take charge of the event at the scene. there was a lot of radio difficulty. We had multiple squads on multiple frequencies, and that ultimately got ironed out very quickly. But there was some confusion among the rescue squads responding as where to go for the staging area. So what was really happening inside of Norris Hall? The Blacksburg Police Department was sweeping classrooms. It was at this point in time that the shooter took his own life. The police department was actually able to gain access to Norris Hall very quickly. They got in within about a minute's time frame. For those of you that don't remember, because it's been a little time since the event passed, he actually had chained all the doors shut in the building. He had taken chains with him and chained all the doors. They were able to break those chains and get in. And reports from one of our survivors who actually watched the shooter take his own life, when the police SWAT teams were coming down the hallway, she vividly remembers there being scurrying, and you could hear activity in the hallway. And she vividly remembers a police officer racking his shotgun, that ch-ch sound, and at that point in time, the shooter took his own life. So there wasn't an active shooter by the time they got to him. So that enabled EMT and SWAT medics to get into the classrooms very quickly to do initial triage. I want to keep in mind that the two first TAC medics that went in were Virginia Tech students. So imagine that. Imagine being a volunteer on the Virginia Tech Rescue Squad. Pretty much what do you do when you're on the Virginia Tech Rescue Squad? They're highly trained, but they shuffle people back and forth from the dorms to the hospital. Maybe a kid drinks too much. Maybe there's an overdose. Are they truly ready to go in and look at their peers, in some cases, some of their friends, to do initial triage on those individuals? Once the building was deemed safe by the police and the TAC medics, EMTs then moved in to begin addressing victims and moving viable victims out into the hallway to be additionally transferred. There was a fair amount of confusion outside of Norris Hall. As you can imagine, a college campus with 26,000 students, early in the morning, everybody's going to class, there was quite a bit of scurrying around. Police were on the scene, SWAT teams were on the scene. They were making sure that those students and those got out of the line of fire. That was their primary concern. So there was an initial amount of chaos there. Ironically, the one victim hobbled to a nearby transit bus, and you think about a shooting like this. I was talking with some of my colleagues at the table earlier. We actually received our first victim via public transportation. This young man, immediately when he realized there was a shooting, jumped out of a second floor window and broke his leg and hobbled over to a transit station, and he saw a bus approaching, and the marquee said Montgomery Regional Hospital, and he waved him down, and he said, "There's a shooting in Norris Hall. Can you take me to the hospital? I've jumped out of a window and broken my leg." So that's how we got our first victim. It's just ironic, and one of the things we're talking about, typically you do see a lot of walk-ins, and that's how you know there's been a disaster, but I don't know that they come by bus. So there was a lot of other units that were there. We used the START triage algorithm. It's recognized in the state of Virginia. Simple triage and rapid treatment, primarily green, yellow, red, and black. Unfortunately, in this scenario, there were a number of black tags on the scene. There were some improvements that were done on the fly. I'm not going to get into too much detail on this because you have the slides in front of you. But needless to say, you can imagine there was a lot of ongoing adjustments throughout the day to make certain that triage was going well, patient care was going well, and those patients were getting shipped as quickly as possible. At about 10:51, you got to remember, about 9:45, the initial response came out. At 10:51, it was all viable patients had been transported at that point in time. And I think that these are some of the poignant moments throughout that morning that really settled in with me and others. At 10:58, there was a false alarm of a second shooter on campus. You can imagine the distraction that occurred. And then there was, at 11:18, supposedly a bomb threat at a building adjacent to Norris Hall. So there was a lot of erroneous information, but at 11:51, it was confirmed that all viable patients had been transported from the scene. The EMS response, 29 total EMS transportations, 26 26 total number of victims transported. 3 were transported from Montgomery and New River Valley Hospital to the Level 1 Trauma Center. The final deceased or black count was 33. 14 agencies, 27 squads, and 120 EMS personnel. This is some language from the governor's review panel that just speaks to the EMS response, and the only thing that I can just tell you from a single word is outstanding. Just amazing first responder care, and there was a lot of lives that were saved because of it. We'll real quickly jump into the hospital's response, kind of where we were that morning and what we did. Again, I talked about the 2 primary victims coming in. One was dead on arrival. The other one, unfortunately, died en route. The young lady, Emily, died en route to Roanoke Memorial Hospital. Both had gunshot wounds to the head. And we actually were a crime scene at the time because the young man who came in dead on arrival, the police were there with his body. And as many of you all know, if you are in the, possession of or watching over a body of a murder, then you are actually a crime scene also. So we had a lot of police, a lot of first responders in our ER at the time. And our chief nursing officer, Larissa Cole, was down there rounding. I had been down there rounding. I had actually come back up to administration. We thought it was, let's move on and get about our Monday. At 9:45, the first responders and the police that were in our emergency room, their radios went crazy. At that point in time, Larissa Coles, our chief nursing officer, Larissa came back down to administration. We immediately initiated a procedure whereby we called physicians to the ER stat. We used our trauma codes for that. And then we initially went on controlled access. At about 10 o'clock, we did get information from the scene. An EMT, who actually is a nurse in our emergency room, was the scene commander communicating with our emergency department. And it was a very simple statement: prepare for multiple gunshot wound victims. We immediately called our disaster code and opened our command center and did all the things that you do, because that's what we do. We drill and we do these things. We practice for them. And I can tell you, as the person who was going to be leading the command center, and for any of you all that are ever going to be in that position, if your first thought isn't, oh my God, what do I do? Then something's, that's going to be your first thought. Okay, what do I do? Oh my God. But you quickly realize what you need to do because you trained for that. We had a big decision in front of us because it was a Monday morning. I just wonder if there's any financial people in the room. We had to make the decision to cancel all of our elective OR procedures that day. It's a big decision, but it's the right decision, and it's a decision you have to make. You're either going to respond to a disaster or you're not going to respond, okay? We had 29 patients. We discharged 29 patients in 30 minutes from our ambulatory care department that were set up for surgery that day. Preps, the whole shooting match. We did not get one complaint. And I think that speaks to the way our staff handled the situation. Quickly, there were 3 general surgeons in the emergency department waiting for patients. The first patients arrived from North Hall about 10:05. We had 2 yellow patients, and there were gunshot wounds. So what do? We immediately put them in our trauma bays. Probably not the best thing to do with yellow triaged patients is to clog up your 2 trauma bays with those patients. So that's a lesson learned for us, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on. We quickly realized we had other needs for those beds and moved those patients to different rooms. We had some stable ER patients that we quickly transferred to our outpatient surgery area that were in the department. There were not many patients in the emergency department at the time of the event, so we quickly transferred them to the outpatient surgery area, used that area to treat them, and ultimately discharged those patients. At about 10:30, there were some things going on, and I call these the behind-the-scenes things. This is a picture of our disaster carts that we keep all the time. Our blood supply, the lab knew immediately. We need to reassess the blood supply and call the American Red Cross. The pharmacy knew immediately, reassess the pharmaceutical supply, and send a pharmacist to the emergency department, which they did. That pharmacist stayed there all day. I don't know that we called him Morphine Man, but he was there all day. And then we immediately moved these trauma carts to the hallway behind the emergency department so that we could restock immediately as we used up supplies. At 10:30, 4 gunshot wound red victims arrived via EMS. And as quickly, just like with the fire, as quickly as those 4 patients came into our hospital, the media calls started. And it was intense. It was a big distraction in the command center. Ultimately, we were able to push those calls where they needed to go. We followed our protocols and did the right thing. But it was at this time that we had another difficult decision to make. Because very shortly after we received those 4, we got a call from the scene that said, you have 5 more coming. And there was a very pointed discussion between Larissa and the on-scene commander at the scene, between her, him, and then we also had an EMT on site. And it was simply, can we take any more patients? And the simple question was asked, and it got heated at time, Larissa, how many more? Because we really struggled from a standpoint of the distance. Our closest hospital that we could shift someone to is 15 to 17 miles away. And Larissa's standing in the emergency room trying to decide, am I getting ready to sentence somebody's kid to death because I'm going to put them in an ambulance and send them 15 miles away? It's a very difficult decision. But we also knew that at that time, given our resources as a community hospital, we were quite stressed at the time. So we did send patients to Carilion New River Valley Medical Center, and we also sent 5 patients to Lewis Gale Medical Center, which is our large sister hospital in Salem, Virginia, about 30 minutes away. Fortunately, most of those injuries were green and yellow victims. The 5 more victims did arrive. We did have, similar to the nightclub incident, our chief of surgery and Larissa were doing rapid triage at the entryway of the ER. We had started doing that process back in the ER. They made a decision on the fly to actually try to intercept those patients at the door. It was just a better place to do it. We needed to get them to the right care settings. But at this time, when these 5 additional victims came, our chief of surgery, who was our last general surgeon available, decided there was one that came in that was critical enough. The picture that we've shown once already that I'll show again, the young man being carried by the first responders, Kevin Stern, he had tourniquet his own leg with a lamp cord in the room. When the EMTs found him, the TAC medics found him, they were probably a breath away from putting a black tag on him. They instead elected to put their own cuff on his leg. They rolled him to the front entrance of the hospital, and Dr. Steckel, who was our chief of surgery at the time and who was doing triage, loosened that cuff. Blood shot up and hit the ceiling, and he said, I got to take this guy to the ER right now. From the time that kid hit the door to the time he had an anesthesia mask going on his face was 7 minutes. At that point in time, though, we had no general surgeon, so we did call Lewis Gale, which was the easier call for us to make in the situation because those providers that were credentialed within the HCA way of credentialing, so we could call them and say, hey, can you send somebody 30 miles instead of sending maybe a provider who is credentialed at the New River Valley Medical Center that we had no knowledge of. Immediately, we called for disaster and trauma counselors to come to the hospital. It was a lesson we had learned from a previous incident, which I'll touch on in a little bit. But we got some really unclear communication right after 11 o'clock, and it was at that point in time that I grabbed our disaster coordinator, and because he was probably the only one there that I could really grab on. I grabbed him. I said, go to Virginia Tech, find out what's going on, and call me back. And this is really where, in these smaller communities, relationships are key. We had David Linkus walk right into the command center at Virginia Tech, and no one questioned who he was because they knew him already. Because we had done regional drills together, and these faces were known to each other. So once he got there, he started relaying information back to me. We did have the additional surgeon arrive at about 11:30, got there very quickly. But at 11:51, I received a very somber phone call from David on the scene. And I said, David, what is it? Is it 50 more? Is it 30 more? Or all these rumors are flying around? He says, God, I wish it was 30 more. There's no more patients coming. The 30 they were talking about were the 30 that had been shot and killed. We were taken off divert at about 12:12. We did have 2 more patients arrive after that, and we cleared our condition green at 1:30, so we were open for business 3.5 hours later. We remained on controlled access, not lockdown, but controlled access until the last patient was discharged. Many of you all know there's a big difference between lockdown and controlled access. Lockdown is no one comes, no one goes. Controlled access is you have a single point of entry. If people have business at the hospital and they can prove their business, show identification, they can be allowed entry. We had disaster and trauma coordinators on site for weeks afterwards. We did this with 3 general surgeons, 2 orthopedic surgeons, 1 ENT, 1 urologist, 1 ED physician, 2 more came, 2 physician's assistants, and a nurse practitioner. The general surgeons training, you can see 2 of 3 were trained in thoracic work, 3 of 3 had vascular experience. 6 operating rooms, 3 anesthesiologists, 4 CRNAs. This slide I want to point out to you all is a list of patients as they came in by time, their triage status, their injuries, and their ultimate disposition. I feel like it's important to point out, if you look at the bottom of the slide, that in 51 minutes we received 13 patients with 26 gunshot wounds. I would challenge anyone to find a large academic urban hospital that sees 26 gunshot wounds in a 51-minute period of time. It was very intense, as you can imagine, and we saved a lot of lives. We're really proud of the work that occurred in our hospital. 10 of those patients were admitted, 1 was transferred, and 2 were discharged. There was some initial kind of reevaluation midway through. I talked about the triage being moved further out into the main triage area so that we could, and this is the area, you can see it's not real big. We're not a huge hospital, right? This is the hallway, the ambulance bay where the triage occurred. But that really was a good move by the team down in the ER because it enabled us to get those patients to where they needed to be very quickly. Obviously, it was a national story. This was the USA Today headline. They very quickly picked up on the fact that there was a regional response for the victims. This is a shot of the USA Today article. This is, again, a breakdown of the total patients, not just the Montgomery patients, but all patients. Montgomery's at the top, Level 3 Trauma Center. You can see the number of patients we had. Next is New River Valley, then Lewis Gale Medical Center, and then the Level 1 Trauma Center, Roanoke Memorial Hospital. Talk a little bit about what went well. We feel like a lot went well, and I can tell you that it's really hard to, I guess there comes a time when you can talk about what went well, but it's not right after because there's so much care that still needs to be provided and there's so much sorrow in the community. This was an AHA article. They came and interviewed me, and we talked about regular drills and emergency preparedness. This is an article from the ANA. They came and interviewed some of the ER nurses and OR nurses that cared for the patients. And this is a Joint Commission Environment of Care newsletter that they came and also did a story on us. What went well? Well, how many of you out there preach to your staff that disasters never happen on a Monday morning at 8 a.m.? Because we do. It's always going to happen on a Tuesday night at 4:30 in the morning when everybody's sound asleep in their bed. This did not happen. Fortunately, very fortunately, we had full staff in the hospital. And a lot of staff had stuck around from those first 2 very early morning shootings just to help out. And so we had a lot of people on site. Incredible teamwork, hospital-wide. We believe our trauma designation really helped out and really helped us care for these victims more rapidly and in a different way than we might have not otherwise done if we weren't a trauma center. Regular drills, typically in the past, we had done 1 to 2 small disaster drills and usually another 1 to 2 regional drills. Actually, and this is just gives you a feel for the types of drills that we do regionally. This happened after the shooting in October 2007, and I just talked about some of the ways we drill as a region. Patient re-triage and room assignment at the ED door went well. Patients receiving immediate screening in the room and prioritizing their care went well. The disaster carts, what a godsend to have those ready and have those supplies ready to be restocked when you need them. I cannot put into words really the value of our medical staff and our hospital staff in this event. They just came. And that's really all I can say. They just showed up. Yes, we worked our call trees and we did all that stuff, but they just came. We had GYN physicians show up in the ER and say, I'll go to the OR, I'll hold retractors, I'll do whatever you need me to do. We had 15 to 20 ER and OR nurses that were off duty that got word of it, that showed up immediately. The other thing that went well, pre-established contacts in the community and planning with our community partners. Yes, there's competition in healthcare. We all get it. But when it comes to a disaster, there is not competition. You're all on the same team. You're all caring for your community. You're all trying to save lives. And we feel like the relationships we have with our competitors really aided in this event. And just an overwhelming response from the community and the nation. You know, we're owned by HCA, the hospital is out of Nashville. And we've had hospitals that have been involved with the responses for Columbine, Oklahoma City, Hurricane Katrina, and then the Virginia Tech shootings after that. And I received a phone call early that morning from Jack Bovender, who's the chairman and CEO of our company. And I can remember walking into administration. I'd been out checking on something. I walked into administration, and Susan, my assistant, said, "Hey, Jack Bovender's on the phone for you." And I went, "That's not a good time to be pulling my leg that way." And she said, "No, seriously, he is." I picked up the phone, and he said, "Scott, what do you need? I'll send it." And I honestly believe at that point in time, I could have asked for a pink elephant, and Jack would have tried to find one for me and send it. Because you're talking about a company and an organization that evacuated its own hospitals in Hurricane Katrina, hired our own helicopters, evacuated our hospitals, Tulane Medical Center, and then evacuated the other hospitals. Some of y'all may or may not know that. Those helicopter evacuations that took place in Hurricane Katrina were paid for solely by HCA. So it's an organization that knows what it means to make sure that the resources are in place. And it was just overwhelming for me as a CEO to have the senior level leadership in our company just say, whatever you need, I'll send it. Counselors were available quickly. We had learned that lesson previous, and I'll get there. And they were there for many weeks after the tragedy. Let's talk real quickly about lessons learned. I feel like we're doing okay here on time. We did have some previous emergency events at the hospital. My first 14 months at Montgomery Regional Hospital were marked by 2 months after I got there, had a security guard shot and killed in the emergency room. A subsequent manhunt ensued, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. 6 months later, Virginia Tech happened, and the following August, there was a carbon monoxide poisoning at a local apartment complex. So I kind of feel like Schleprock from the Flintstones with the little black cloud hanging over my head sometimes, but quickly, you know, in a very short period of time, had a lot of events. But the one in August of 2006 really helped, unfortunately, prepare us for what happened 6 months later. There was an inmate who had come to the hospital in the middle of the night, had faked an injury, had kind of lured the staff to a comfort level with some joking and friendly conversation, and had been to the bathroom multiple times. No one really knew why. Guess they'd use the bathroom. About the fourth time he went to the bathroom, the sheriff's deputy who was guarding him got a little curious and heard some commotion in the bathroom. So he opened up the door to check on him. The inmate grabbed him, pulled him into the bathroom, closed the door, and beat him unconscious with a metal toilet paper holder. Took his gun and his keys, came out of the room, and as this was happening, my security guard, Derek McFarland, was down in the ER babysitting some tech students who had been out partying too much that night. Came down the hallway, and as the inmate came out of the bathroom, he and Derek met face to face in the hallway. He put the deputy's gun up and shot him at point blank range in the face. He then shot his way out of the emergency room and scrambled off into the woods. There was a manhunt, and it just so happened the next day was the first day of class at Virginia Tech for the 2006-2007 academic year. So they went into lockdown because he was reportedly on their campus. You can see my security guard over on the left, Derek McFarland. The following morning, Corporal Eric Sutphin was riding down a fitness trail that we have called the Huckleberry Trail. He was on his bike. He was looking for the inmate. The inmate was hiding. He rode past. The inmate stepped out from behind a tree and he shot him in the back of the head. And at that point in time was when we really knew we had a problem, because not only did he have one deputy's gun, he had two. And that was when it was reported that he was on campus at Virginia Tech. This is the inmate. His name is, I don't know, his last name's Morva. That's all I've ever called him. But the point of this is that it can happen anywhere. And this is actually a video of his court arraignment. And he sits down and quickly says to the camera, "We're everywhere, and we're just waiting." And I wish I had the video because it's very poignant. But it just goes to show you that it can happen anywhere. And for everybody in this room to recognize that and understand that is key. And I can remember after they found him, Larissa, we went into lockdown because there was supposedly a guy on Virginia Tech's campus. The campus was in lockdown. We went into lockdown, went into disaster readiness mode. They finally found him. They arrested him. And Larissa came back into my office, such a poignant moment. And she said, "Scott, can you imagine multiple gunshot wounds on Virginia Tech campus?" And I said, "No, I can't, Larissa. I can't imagine that." And 6 months later, it happened. But we learned a lot of lessons from it. And one of those lessons we learned was about the counseling and having counseling on site immediately for your staff. It needs to be one of your first calls. If it's not in your disaster plan now, it needs to be. Call the counselors because they will make a difference. You got to call the right ones because some people want to use that as an opportunity to grandstand. So make certain that you have good counseling resources worked into your plan. Practice and drills do pay off. Early decisions to cancel elective OR procedures and move ER patients to the outpatient area, and then having the EMT liaison at the scene. A lot of lessons learned around triage and re-triage. They weren't writing the actual injuries on the tags. We actually had one patient that was sent to us as a yellow that was really a red. And so there were some regional lessons around triage that were learned. Everything's on computer nowadays. We're all going paperless in healthcare, right? But in a disaster situation, sometimes those computers can slow you down a bit. So you may have to go to your paper processes more quickly than you might realize. And then patient ID, trauma packets. We used to only keep, about 10 trauma packets on site, like ready to go. Now we keep 100. Patient ID, simple patient identification is best. The KISS-IT method, you need to just really keep it simple. We had these long trauma numbers that we had signed every patient. And I can remember talking to Larissa about the results and results reporting and how all that kind of went down. And one of the things she said to me was there was a lot of God at work because we never messed up one blood test, one blood match, one lab test, radiology test. They all got assigned to the right patients, but those numbers were really long. So simple numbers are best, at least for us. That's one of the things we learned. Obviously, communications are a real trouble spot during a disaster. Picture a town like Blacksburg with 26,000 college students who all have cell phones. Cell service immediately went out. It was done. So there was no Nextel. There was very little cell phone. Now we've since put some things in place that give us priority with GETS and WPS and some other things. But I wouldn't count on cell phones. And then campus alert systems. This is really where Virginia Tech got beat up a little bit after the fact was on their campus-wide alert system. They now have one of the best campus-wide alert systems in the country, as you can imagine. Administrative liaison from the hospital needs to be dispatched immediately to the scene. Held on to him probably a little bit longer than I should have. Hindsight being 20/20, I would have sent him immediately. But also police and university liaisons need to be at the hospital too. Need for improved communication between the healthcare system. Joint Incident Command is key and critical. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the Noble Training Center in Anniston, Alabama. It's an amazing, amazing place. We've had a number of our staff and directors go to that. I just encourage you to look it up and take advantage of that resource. It's all paid for by HRSA funds, and it's really something as leaders you need to invest in your people, send them off and get the training they need. We had the rooms in our ER were named like the ENT room, the GYN room, trauma room. All that's gone. Now we have ER room 1, ER room 2, ER room 3. Good lesson for us to learn. So we change those numbers post-event. Larger waiting area for family and friends. You will become a sanctuary when a disaster occurs. And picture a college campus, again, a college town. Sororities, fraternities, Corps cadets, all these kids showed up. They thought their friends were there. They didn't know. We probably had 250 kids that showed up. We had to find a place for them. And we did. But you have to find those spots and assign the right people to make sure that information is getting disseminated properly. And then delegation of assignments not normally in employees' daily job duties. Our accounting department, our health information department fielded a lot of phone calls, and we're trying to match up parents and kids. And that was really tough, and some of those folks needed counseling afterwards because as the day wore on, it quickly became apparent that if you weren't on the hospital's list, and we had all the information for all the hospitals, that you weren't on a list. And you can imagine someone who is a medical records clerk who's not trained in how to deal with a family, tell them, well, your son or daughter is not on our list. You need to call the university. Tough phone call. Lockdown and controlled access is a challenge with limited security personnel on site. Staff compliance in a lockdown situation is absolute. You cannot have them going outside doors or propping open doors to, grab lunch from their wife who's dropping it off to them or their husband. And then we were very fortunate because we had Virginia State Police come and help us. And I remember I called him my bear. I still don't know who he is. I don't, and I hope I get to see him someday. There's a guy about the size of one of those doors back there, and he showed up and he said, Mr. Hill, I'm here to help with security. And I said, well, how long can you stay? And he said, I'm not leaving until you tell me to go. And I said, oh, man, that's great. And he stood at the front door of the hospital like this. And he looked like a state trooper should look. He had a hat on. And I watched so many people walk up to him and get within about 10 feet, and they went. Especially media. Again, practice and drills do pay off. There's some panel recommendations that I'm not going to get into too much detail. You can read those, but I do want to touch on this real quick. www.psychealthroanoke.com. Dr. John Heil, he and 30 counselors put together a paper after the event that counseled the TAC medics, the EMS, police, our healthcare workers, the students, their families. It's a really interesting paper to read. It's got some really poignant stuff in it. I wish I had more time to jump into that, but I don't. I can tell you, though, it's a really interesting article to read, and it talks about the hospital as a sanctuary, the need for counseling after a traumatic event. And I will tell you, these TAC medics who went in to triage these kids, they lost so many. And we did a critical incident debriefing for them. And after we did that, we went upstairs and we showed them the ones they saved because they needed to see that. They felt guilty. They felt like they could have done more. They needed to see the lives they saved. Again, I talked about the hospital as a sanctuary, and then the questions of ownerships and partnerships and who's in charge and opportunism and making sure that you're screening your volunteers. There's a lot of opportunistic people in the world that want to use an opportunity to come in and counsel someone or chaplain someone as an opportunity to proselytize and have conversations and do things that just really are not appropriate at that time. And then maintaining what's called a therapeutic milieu within your hospital. Jane touched on it. You've got to give your patients an environment where they can heal. And if that means saying no to the media, got to say no. This is a shot of the inn at Virginia Tech. I wish it was a little bit bigger. There's about 130 satellite trucks in the parking lot. We had 13 in our parking lot. And I just want to touch on some of the lessons learned from a media perspective. It's a global story, and we had news agencies from many countries on site. And it was, they were from everywhere. I mean, I was blown away by it. We set up a reporter row in our parking lot, and we were fielding, just in media calls alone, about maybe 350 to 400 calls a day, just for media. You know, you have to know kind of who's who in the media if you're going to deal with them, because all the ones on that first line, they all think that you owe them something. And guess what? You don't. We said no to every single one of those people because it wasn't the time for us to be on the air talking about the situation. We didn't feel like it was right. New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, many healthcare publications, they were all there, all of them. And it was as intense scenario as I've ever been involved with. Again, overwhelming call volume. The solution is to staff up. You got to take the calls. And again, and I think Jane touched on it a little bit or in the question and answer session, you can't not give information to the media, okay? Because they're going to fill the vacuum with wrong information if you don't give them something to go on. So there's a real urge to hunker down in these scenarios. But what you need to do, what we did, I don't say what you need to do. You need to decide what you need to do. What we did was we established a reporter hotline, an internet link. We were proactive with our wire service releases, and we provided updates every 2 to 3 hours. Even if there was no update, we provided an update. We felt like it was important to keep giving that information out on the survivors. This is me dealing with the media in one of those regular news release periods. This picture is a good picture, but it doesn't show all the people on the other side. It was really thick, a lot of people asking questions, and I'm a naturally competitive person. And I had a job to do, which was to protect my patients and their health information. And the media had a job to do, which was to get the information. So for me, it almost turned into a little bit of a game. But you just have to be able to banter back and forth and do the right thing by your patients. You know, one of the very first news releases or press releases came out and I said, look, I'm not going to give any information on patient injuries. I'll give you patient status and that's it, immediately. Well, would you classify the injuries you have as gunshot wounds or broken bones and people that have fallen out, had jumped out of windows? And I looked at that report and I said, well, it was a shooting. So, you just have to kind of figure out your best way to deal with the media. I took it very seriously that I wanted to protect our patients, and so that was the route that I took. There is a glare of the spotlight. I called that thing in front of me the octopus, and it scared me every time I walked up to it. But at the end of the day, I knew that if I did right by my patients, I was doing the right thing. You need to find the right spokesperson. I'm not trying to say it was me. It just happened to be that day. Something administrative, someone clinical. 2 isn't always better than 1. We put 2 doctors in front of the media, and it was a disaster. No offense if there's any doctors here, but it was. You talk about 2 people trying. Let me tell my story, and I'll tell my story. No, it was a mess. So, it just was a mess. I wish I could put it some other way. It was interesting. You need to dive into the pool and add up when the time is right. You got to let your employees tell their story because they're so great and they do such good work. You got to give them that chance. You also have to deal with the families too because some patients want to tell their story. So you need to sit down with them and explain their options, and you need to be open with reporters. What we ended up doing that really kind of got the press off our back a little bit was we took an opportunity to have a pool. So Associated Press sent in a wire reporter, CBS sent in a cameraman, NBC sent in a mic person, and we let them choose. And we said, you guys figure it out, okay? But only one of you for each one of these things is coming in. So they divided it up. And we sat them down with the families. And that was a good opportunity for some of those families to talk about their kids and what was going on. And I didn't realize it at the time, but one of the mothers, actually Kevin Stern, the kid with the injured leg, his mother took it as an opportunity to get her shot in too. She looked at one of the reporters, and they were the questions were kind of winding down, and she said, so let me ask you a question. Where are you staying? And the reporter kind of looked at her kind of said, oh, we've got a whole block of hotel rooms at the Hampton Inn down the road here. And she said, really? That's great. You know where I'm staying? And he looked at her and said, well, no, ma'am, I don't. She said, I'm staying at one of his doctor's houses because I can't get a hotel room. So it was interesting. You got to be careful with it, okay? We found them a home. We put them in the parking lot. We said, this is where you guys have to live, period, no ifs, ands, or buts. We monitored their behavior. We made tough choices about access. Remember your hometown reporters, folks. The national media is going to come in and eat you up. They're going to feed on you in the feeding frenzy, and they're going to leave. And at the end of the day, guess who's left? The local media. Take care of them. So where does reasonable involvement end and objectionable self-promotion begin? That's really only a question you can answer. When do we tell our story? That's something you have to decide for yourself. Some other considerations, visual impact, media impact. The long-term impact, acute need, really peaked in day 4. You know, the patients swept through our hospital in a wave. And, you know, it was ER first, then the OR, then the floors, and then everybody just needed to take a deep breath. And so that was really when the counseling we really needed. We lost staff because of this. You're going to lose folks when you have these intense times. Some people are just not going to be able to cope, and you may ultimately lose some folks when you have these types of events. I want to talk quickly about the recovery. This is Nikki Giovanni. She's a poet laureate, faculty member at Virginia Tech, and she came, and there was a big memorial service that the president attended, and she stood up and gave a speech and said, how do you make sense of a tragedy? And really, at the end of the day, you don't, and you can read the words of her speech, and then I've got a video a little bit later on that has some of her words in it. Really, at the end of the day, you don't make sense of it, but you do have to move on. And her point was, we are Virginia Tech. We will move on. We will overcome this, and we will be better because of it. So we also had, in day 4, an opportunity to do something that I'm going to try to get through this without choking up, because I get choked up every time I see it. Everybody was just kind of trudging through, and we needed a pick-me-up. And I had one of our staff members come up to me and say, what if we got the band to come play outside of the ICU? And I said, man, how are we going to do that? And sure enough, one of the pastors from my church was walking by, and he goes, well, the band director's at our church. Here, let me give you his phone. Okay. Then I talked to our public information director. She goes, oh, I know that guy. I could call him. We called him. And he was on the phone, and he said, you know, Suzanne, there's no one here. School, they sent all the students home. No one's here. Well, one of his drum majors was in his office, and he stopped the band director, and he said, no, we'll be there. And I expected a few kids to show up in jeans and a T-shirt, and what we got was something that was a lot different. That's our ICU. That's Hillary. At the end of the third quarter of every football game, the band plays the Hokey Pokey. We appreciate it at the hospital. We appreciate you all. Y'all are great students. You're great Hokies. We're proud of all the students in Virginia Tech. So you can see we got something that was a lot different than we expected. This young lady, Hillary, Tech has a big cheer they do at football games. One side of the stadium says, "Let's go," and the other side says, "Hokies." The band had finished playing, and out of her window you hear, "Let's go." Just an amazing, amazing moment. And the band kind of, huh? And then she said, "Let's go." And the band turned around and said, "Hokies." And they had a cheer for about 5 minutes between the two of them. Pretty amazing. The governor came. I don't know if any of you all think that's exciting or not. I can tell you that 18 to 24-year-old college students don't. Go around and tell these kids that the governor's coming, and they kind of look at you and go, huh? Now, on the other hand, tell them that Frank Beamer, the head football coach, is coming to see them. And honestly, they said, "Mom, get my makeup for me. Coach Beamer's coming." President Bush came for the memorial service, had a guy come in my office, plop down his card, and I know I'm running a little long, I apologize. Plop down his card and say, "I'm with the White House and need all the blueprints to your hospital." What? I said, "Is there a number I can call to verify?" "Yeah, it's on the card. It's on the card, call it." I called it, and they said, "He's for real. Give him all the blueprints to your hospital." And I said, "Here's the blueprints to the hospital." I don't know what they did with them. I guess they still got them in case the president ever is there again. And this young man, Kevin Stern, I wish that you all could see him. Because he went from this to 30 days later getting his diploma. This kid was a breath away from being black tagged on the scene. We had a one-year event. This is Kevin over on the left. You can see the nurse grabbing onto his arm. He got a lot of hugs. A lot of those kids did. It was a pretty emotional time. This young lady, Heidi, watched the shooter take his own life. And she graduated last year. She spent the next 2 years of her life teaching kids in inner city Philadelphia how to read because she feels like she needs to make a difference in the world. The young lady on the left, Caitlin, you can see she's got the picture. She's got her hand behind her back. A week later, she was a bridesmaid at her sister's wedding. She had held a door closed so the shooter couldn't get in. And he shot through the door and shot through her hand. She and another student laid down on the floor, put their feet on the door, and gently closed the door. The shooter heard the door click. He came back, and he shot 7 times through the door. She had her hand on the door also. When the bullet hit her hand, she and the other student laid down. They kept him from coming back in that room, and there were survivors that came out of that room. So, you know, as I go into just the end of this, and I've got one more short video to play, you know, the intense sorrow and heartache that exists after the fact, you've got to find a way to overcome that, and I think the community did do a good job of it. And this, I think, you know, there was a candlelight vigil, and they've had one of these every year since the shooting. We just remembered 5 years. And next year will be the 5-year remembrance. So there's activities planned every year, and this will give you maybe a little bit feel for what the community dealt with. That's Norris Hall.
We are Virginia Tech. The Hokie Nation embraces our own and reaches out with open heart and hand to those who offer their hearts and minds. We are strong and brave and innocent and unafraid. We are better than we think and not quite what we want to be. We are alive to the imagination and the possibility. We will continue to invent the future through our blood and tears, through all this sadness. We are the Hokies. We will prevail. We will prevail. We will prevail. We are Virginia Tech.
Thank you.